Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and this is our first week of our class. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time laying the foundation for the class. Of course, we started in 1877, actually. There was a reason for that. We talked about that last time. The end of Reconstruction, 1877, was abrupt. It was not planned. With the election of Rutherford B. Hayes as the Republican candidate in 1877, he tied with in the election, and so it was uh, a deal made between the federal government and the South to let him be president, and in return for that, the federal government would withdraw federal troops from the South where they had been under martial law, as I said last time, and Rutherford B. Hayes would be allowed to ascend the presidency. That had good and bad effects, as we'll talk about as we go along, in that it placed former slaves back into the hands of their former masters. They had no place to go and were still on the plantations. And that's one area that you find no history written about very much. We just assume, and you know, of course, what happens when you assume that slavery was over, Native and African Americans were freed, and they lived happily ever after. That's the consensus of what most people believe, or that they left the plantation and went other places. But you've got to remember, number one, they had no money to travel. They had nowhere to go. And so the only thing they knew was that they had a roof over their heads, living in their slave cabin where they'd always been. And remember that that was the life that these people, the only life they had known. They did not know what the greater world looked like. Many of them had never been off the plantation since their families had been brought there. They had been raised there, many of them born there. They weren't allowed to roam and to go wherever and visit cities and towns. A few did get to go to town to help buy supplies and things of that nature, or own errands for their master if they were trusted, but they were pretty much held to the plantation. So when the economy ended, I mean, you can imagine they had nowhere to go. Few people did leave, going and looking for their mates, their children, or their husband or wife that had been sold off to other plantations. And that usually ended in disappointment because they had been forced to remarry and have children. Now, let me say this about that. The Atlantic slave trade ended when England got out of the business around 1808. So from 1808 to 1860, the slaves were bred, for lack of a better word, on the plantations and sold off, basically like cattle. So when you went to buy slaves, you were looking for breeding stock, basically, and that's a terrible way to put that. I don't know of any. Slavery is not beautiful, and today these Christian nationalists that try to gloss over and emboss and say differently are lying about history. That is not true. Christians were involved, and to a great extent, in the 1850s, the Baptist Church split between North and South over slavery, and Christians wanted to give as an excuse for slavery that, well, we're at least teaching them the gospel, and they'll find Jesus and live happily after in heaven. So look forward to heaven. Your life here is not going to be much, but you know that justified a whole heap of things about slavery. African Americans were not allowed to sit on the main floor of a church. I preached a revival in a church in my home state of South Carolina that still had the old slave balconies, and they had an outside door, so they went up and came in separately from the white congregation that sat on the floor. Those two members of the same church had no fellowship whatsoever, and would have had and didn't have separate churches because they wanted to keep their eye on their slaves, and they felt like that slaves meeting of their own accord would cause rebellions and all kinds of things. And of course, they didn't want to teach the slave to read because then that gave him an avenue out. So they didn't get to read their own Bible. They were just told what to believe. And most of the message in those churches was behave, do what you're told, obey your master, don't rebel. That was the message they got in that process. I'm just saying that in passing, having grown up in a state that was very much the center of slavery. I understand that. You also understand that my state was very slow in uh, uh, desegregating, even when that rule came down in 1954 to do it with all haste. South Carolina did not desegregate until I was in seventh grade, which was 1972. And I remember it well. I still remember black and white water fountains, black and white bathrooms, and African Americans having to come to the back door of a restaurant to get food and go sit under a tree and eat. They could not come in and sit down at a table or a lunch counter and eat food like we would do. So I have a very different perspective on slavery because of having grown up in that. And that's what happened the next 100 years after 1877 in the South. They basically spent 100 years licking their wounds and mad over slavery ending and finding ways to make African Americans' lives absolutely a hell on earth. And that's exactly what they did. So 1877 moved the federal protections from former slaves, and they were back in the hands of their former owners on their plantations. And poor whites that had been bankrupt by the war joined the slaves as sharecroppers and worked the crops together. And they got a little pittance of money out of their share, but then they had to buy all their goods from the owner's store, and it was exorbitant prices, and so they basically broke even from year to year. They didn't make money or get wealthy. So 1877 is a key year to understand that the federal government gave up on Reconstruction and went back to Washington and caused a bigger mess than they had started. We talk about biblical perspective in this chapter in realizing that it was fought during one of the great revivals of American history, if not the greatest. I think I may have mentioned you to that already. There's a great book out by Mark Noll called The Theological Crisis of the Civil War. If you like to read, you should read that book. Anything by Mark Noll you should read, but that book's important because he makes the statement that both North and South claimed God was on their side, and they both, these guys went out. Now, get the picture: 700,000 men die between the North and the South in the Civil War. That is a huge chunk of the population. That is almost a son to every family. At least two families had five sons and a husband killed on each side. Think about the massive death count just because they could not come to terms and talk to each other. Think about that in light of our own special on our own certain day. When you reach the point that you cannot talk between the two sides, then all that's left is civil war. I cringe to think that we are approaching that. But how many lives will have to be lost before we get back to where we can talk again? But that happened here. That we lived that in 1860 to 65, 700,000 people, and both sides saying God was on our side. They would go to war every day, kill each other, come home, clean up, eat dinner, have a religious service, have preaching, get right with God, and go out and do it again. I cannot give you a reason why Christians did that. It's unfathomable to me. I've studied this stuff over and over again. To think you are in the midst of the greatest revival on the planet and it has no effect whatsoever on your hatred for your brother in the Civil War. So this was really we're going to look at some of the moral dimensions this week of slavery, the federal government's role in shaping justice. Scripture, tells us that we should give dignity to every human being. I hate the soapbox, but these are things that we have forgotten already, and we're 150 years away from the Civil War and doing the same kinds of things today with other human beings. So the question is, we never learn our lesson. Humans never learn the lesson of history, and they go on repeating it. History may not, Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but it certainly does echo a lot. And that's what you see here. So basically, you ought to be able to, by the time you finish this section, you should be able to understand something of the Civil War. something of the causes of the Civil War. And there are two sides to that issue in the North and in some places in the South. It was over slavery. The South wanted to crotch it in terms of states' rights, that a state had the right to hold people in slavery and to use their labor and all those things that the federal government had no right to tell us what to do. And there's so many ways in which that's invalid. I won't even take the time to talk about it, but that was exactly, and that's what you hear today. You still hear that today. Remember, the South sat 100 years nursing their grudge and their wounds, and so they still hold that same. And I'm a Southerner. I came from the most southern state other than Mississippi, probably in the South. We were the first to withdraw. I stood last week at Fort Moultrie and Fort in Charleston, and contemplating that that's where the Civil War started, was the attack in South Carolina. South Carolina, within months, they threatened to withdraw from the Union when, if Lincoln was elected in 1856, and he was not. And when he was elected in 1859, within a month, they had withdrawn from the Union. And other states followed them, and the war started in Charleston. So I was contemplating that, thinking about the numbers dead and the reasons, and if it was worth it. How many lives? Recent commentator said, and I'll not give a name because I don't want to inflame people, but he said it's all right for us to have a number of deaths due to gun violence in order to be able to keep our guns. What is the price for? I mean, how much is too many deaths? 700,000? Take every war that the United States has been in since its inception and add them up, and they don't come to 700,000 people. So we kill ourselves. And so that's the thing you're going to think about this week when you do that. The reasons then would be mainly two given: one, slavery; one, states' rights. We're hearing that again today about states threatening to withdraw from the Union. Is it possible? Yes, it probably is. And the impact. We've talked about that already. Number of deaths. The South was destroyed as an economic engine. Amazing that on the eve of the Revolution, my home state, South Carolina, was the richest of the 13 colonies. At the end of the Civil War, it was among the poorest. And so they destroyed an industry. They only had one industry. They did not do like the North and diversify and have factories and all those things. That was all they had, was slavery. They raped, if you would, the land, destroyed the fertility of the land, and it's still not where I grew up. Was the Red Hills of South Carolina are famous because they let all the topsoil wash away, and they expended it using cotton. Cotton destroyed the land, never put anything back, and they just kept moving west, moved into Texas, moved into all these other things, starting plantations like that. And if the war hadn't started, they would have destroyed those things as well. Um, and so the Reconstruction, we don't know what Lincoln planned. Lincoln probably would have been a kinder and gentler leader than Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a Southerner who happened to be the vice president, who happened to be president. Think about that. A Southerner as the U.S. president after the Civil War. And he brought some things to bear that probably were not Lincoln's best plan. Lincoln wanted to just forgive everybody, walk away, and go back to being human beings again. The North was determined to punish the South. And that's why, in the end, even after the South was defeated, surrendered, they marched back through the South, burned Atlanta, burned Columbia, South Carolina, because they were destroying stocks of cotton that had been saved and held for the country to restart with, and they destroyed the finances that they had. One example tells you the situation in the South. There was not one bank in the South after the Civil War, and the federal government required you to have $50,000 in cash to open a bank, and that just wasn't there. And so the only way they could get started was that the property owners, who had been the former masters who owned the land, would open their little stores on their property and would sell at exorbitant prices to former slaves and poor whites at an exorbitant price and on credit. They extended credit for that because when the crop came in and you owned a quarter of it as a farmer, 75% went to the owner. That quarter, you had to pay your debts up, and many times your debt would be greater than you had money to pay, and many times you had to go into the next year owing money. And so that's how the South formed after the Civil War. A lot of angst, as I said. In the North, they gave federal troops that died in the Civil War their widows a pension. In the South, that was not done. And so many Southerners, if they had any money, they raked and scraped together trying to help the widows of Civil War dead, built these huge monuments, statues. It was a religion. It became a religion. It was called the religion of the lost cause. And they would go there and meet at these statues, lay a wreath, have a service, preaching everything as though they worshiped that. And lots of people did look back at the Civil War in the South, and it was their God. It ruled their lives. We still have people today in my state that drive around with the Confederate flag and dog in your truck, your gun rack, that kind of thing. And the issue of the Civil War flag has been a part of just kind of a flashback to show you how many people still hold on to those ideas of over 100 years ago. So, President Lincoln, good leader. I encourage you to read about him. I had not done that until recently because Civil War history is not my first love. I love American religious history, but I have read a great deal lately. Ruth Kearns Goodwin, I'm sorry, wrote a couple of books that you ought to read. She was the biographer of Lyndon Johnson, but she wrote one on A Team of Rivals about Lincoln's placing his enemies in board positions because he wanted honest evaluations and not yes men. And then she wrote another one on leadership, and Lincoln was one in that where she compared him to other presidents. But there's a tremendous amount of good reading available on Lincoln. It's been mammoth. Everybody's treated Lincoln, written about Lincoln. And so I would encourage you to read some in this period. You have some videos and readings and things from the classes. Be sure that you do those. Read your chapters and get a background. And if you have comments or questions, feel free to let me know. I'll talk to you again next week. Take care.